so you don't believe in God.
What you have to realize is that science today operates under what we call methodological naturalism.
Evolution does not work no matter how old the universe.
Okay, let's begin session number 2. So we've looked at the question of evolution with regard to the Bible, and seeing that evolution cannot fit within a biblical worldview in light of the Hebrew there of Genesis 1. So let's look at what science has to say about this question as well. That's always one of the big questions that I've had is, you know, as much as as people try to make arguments based on the Hebrew, it amazes me because the science does not support this either. So why are we trying to come up with a way to squeeze evolution into the text? There's just no need to do that. And there's no reason to do that. So let's look first of all at the first big question, and that is, where did this exploding cosmic egg come from? Now, if you're a naturalist, then you have to believe that everything in the universe can be explained purely naturally. Okay, so instead of God creating the universe fully formed, you're going to have to come up with a way that the universe could create itself. And so the naturalist, therefore, generally believes in some form of what we call cosmic evolution. And this starts with usually the Big Bang and eventually adding neo-Darwinian evolution today. And so according to the currently popular form of the Big Bang theory, which seems to change ad hoc on almost a daily basis, it seems, if you stay up with the literature, 13.7 billion years ago, everything in the universe was originally in one speck, just in one infinitely dense and hot ball that rapidly expanded, inflated, and inflation is what they call this, like a balloon. And so within the first speck of a second, the universe went through this rapid inflation, expanding faster than the speed of light. With particles forming in the first few seconds and so forth. Cosmic evolution then occurs for billions of years, including some form of biological evolution. And other speakers this weekend will respond to the idea of deep time, eons of years with regard to science, the Big Bang Theory, as well as the biological side of things with neo-Darwinism. But for this section, let's just disregard all of that and focus in on the first, or perhaps the second really foundational pillar upon which any naturalistic theory must rest, and that is, how could it begin? Now, in order to answer that question, we want to actually examine the evidence, specifically the scientific evidence. And now in science, we draw conclusions from the evidence, and we draw many conclusions. But the ultimate conclusions that we draw, the conclusions that are backed by the most evidence, we call laws. The laws of science are conclusions that have been discovered through extensive scientific investigation, gathering mounds of evidence that all points to some conclusion. According to the McGraw-Hill Dictionary of Scientific and Technical Terms, a scientific law is a regularity which applies to all members of a broad class of phenomena. Keep in mind 3 things about scientific laws. Number 1, scientific laws describe what has been observed to occur in nature. They say nothing directly about supernature. Number 2, a scientific law applies to all members of a broad class of phenomena, not just some. There are no exceptions to a law of science. Notice the words of famous atheist, theoretical physicist, and cosmologist of Cambridge University, Stephen Hawking. The universe is a machine governed by principles or laws that can be understood by the human mind. I believe that the discovery of these laws has been humankind's greatest achievement. But what's really important is that these physical laws, as well as being unchangeable, are universal. They apply not just to the flight of the ball, but to the motion of a planet and everything else in the universe. Unlike laws made by humans, the laws of nature, notice, cannot ever be broken. That's why they're so powerful. The laws of nature are fixed. And so notice that naturalists not only claim to believe firmly in the laws of science, but they acknowledge that they are exceptionalist. Now, a third thing to keep in mind about the laws of science, a scientific law is by definition rational. It is the conclusion that has been drawn from all of the scientific evidence that we have to this point. In philosophy, you have a law called the law of rationality. And this law says that one should only believe in things for which there is evidence, and if you don't do that, then you are being irrational. Okay, this is the law of rationality, used to determine if a person is being illogical or not. Now, if the law of rationality is violated, if someone draws a conclusion that does not follow from the evidence, then that perpetrator is known to be being irrational, right? Okay, now, if the laws of science are rational, they are the ultimate conclusions from the evidence. So if a person chooses to believe in something that contradicts the laws of science, that person is being, by definition, irrational, right? Easy enough, not complicated. So let's consider the evidence. Specifically, let's look at the laws of thermodynamics to see what they have to say about this question of evolution. I want to take some time to systematically go through the implications of the first and second laws of thermodynamics to make sure that the point is clearly understood. The scientific implications of these two laws alone give strong evidence that evolution does not cut it. Naturalistic evolution does not work. You've got to have a God in the picture. Atheism ultimately fails. All right, now let's stand back and consider the question, where could the universe have originally come from? Logically, you have two main possibilities. Either someone put it here or no one put it here, right? Those are your options. There's no middle ground on this. That's it. Those are your two options. Now, if you are a Bible believer, the creationist answer to that question is, of course, that someone put the universe here. The very first verse of the Bible, Genesis 1:1, we're given the creation model's answer to the question. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, if you were looking at this from a more technical standpoint, how would you describe this from a scientific perspective? From a thermodynamic perspective, we could describe the creation model in this way. And so you imagine that there's a box maybe in your garage, and imagine that it's big enough to fit the entire universe in it. And so the box is the exterior boundary for the whole universe. Everything in the universe is in that box, and so it represents a closed system if we're using thermodynamic terminology. And so this means that there's nothing going into the box because everything's already in there. Everything in the universe is already there. And nothing's going out of the box because we're keeping that boundary of the box encompassing everything in the universe. Now, according to the creation model, before day one, the box was empty, and God essentially opened the box, created the universe, put it in the box, closed it, and sealed it so that nothing else could enter or leave this box. And so the box has remained closed since then, except at those times when God engaged in some form of miraculous activity. So that is activity that momentarily puts a halt to the laws of physics and allows God to do something that is not natural, that is above nature or supernatural. And so that's the creation model in a nutshell. Now, the evolutionary model typically includes some form of the Big Bang Theory. Steady state Big Bang Theory claims that all of the matter and energy in the universe was originally crammed into this sphere the size of a period at the end of a piece of paper, cosmic egg, or they call it the ilum. And then this tiny sphere exploded, so to speak, and hence the Big Bang. Expansion occurs over time until we have the universe as we see it today. Now, the problem is that even if you believe in this theory, it still does not explain where that little sphere even came from, the little ball that supposedly blew up. Where did this come from? Now, even if we were to grant that the Big Bang actually happened, and we'll address that, the fact that that's false on Sunday morning, Brandon will deal with that subject. But where did this ball come from? The Big Bang Theory doesn't answer that question. Evolutionist Alan Guth is a cosmologist and physics professor at MIT, and he admitted that very point, recognizing that the Big Bang attempts to explain why the universe appears to be expanding, but still doesn't explain where the little universal ball originally came from. Notice what he says about this. Inflation itself takes a very small universe, produces from it a very big universe. But inflation by itself does not explain where that very small universe came from. And then he also said, a proposal that the universe was created from empty space is no more fundamental than a proposal that the universe was spawned by a piece of rubber. It might be true, but one would still want to ask where the piece of rubber came from. Now, logically speaking, we can expand our two options for the origin of the universe into three by getting a little bit more specific. The well-known philosopher and evolutionist from the 1800s, Herbert Spencer, he said, respecting the origin of the universe, three verbally intelligible suppositions may be made. We may assert that the universe is self-existent, so it's existed forever, or that it is self-created, it created itself. Those would all fall under the category of no one created it, it created itself. or existed forever, or that it is created by an external agency. And that's true, and that's what reason and logic tell us. You've got three options for this. Now, if two of the three possibilities for the origin of the universe can be shown to be not in harmony with the evidence, it's not scientific based on all the evidence we have, they violate the laws of science, then the other alternative must be the case, logically speaking. Now, if you choose the atheistic route, you're a naturalist, then obviously you've eliminated one of those options. You've eliminated the creation model from the table, and you're left with two possibilities. And in order to attempt to be rational, the atheist has to believe in one of these possibilities because he doesn't accept God. So either the universe is self-created, it's spontaneously generated, or it is self-existent, it is eternal. Now, if you believe in the spontaneous generation option, that is that matter could spontaneously create itself, then in a thermodynamic sense you believe that original box in your garage was initially completely empty. And so let's zoom inside of the box here. And so we're inside of this box. This model claims that no one put matter in the universe, it put itself here. And so according to this model, you can stand around inside of this box and just stare into nothingness, and as long as you give it enough time, all of a sudden, pop, something can just appear. And not only could something pop into existence, but according to this version of the model, a little ball containing all of the mass and energy of the entire universe could just pop into existence. And then, so they say, the Big Bang process started, and eventually, given enough time, the universe expands, life comes into existence, and gradually evolves over time, and then ultimately, you show up in the universe accidentally. Now, we've got problems with this, got some major problems, and we're going to be expounding on those this weekend. But evolutionist Willard Young explained the first law of thermodynamics correctly when he said in describing it that energy can be neither created nor destroyed, but can only be converted from one form to another. And he's right, there's no argument there. That is what the first law of thermodynamics says. In nature, energy can neither be created nor destroyed. You can only convert it from one form into another. And this is also known as the law of conservation of matter or energy. Now, what does this mean practically speaking? The first law says that if you've got a process like wood burning, matter and energy can change into other forms while that's burning, like heat and light and smoke and ash and so forth. But the amount of energy that was in the universe that was present before the wood burned is the same amount of energy in the universe that is present after it burned. So energy hasn't really been disappeared or destroyed from the universe by burning that wood. And no energy has popped into existence in the process either. Now, using more technical terminology, the first law would say that in a closed system like our box that has everything in it in the universe, there's no energy coming into that system. We're leaving it. No one's opening the box and putting anything in there or taking it out. The amount of energy within the boundaries of that system is going to remain constant. And so as this chart shows, the amount of energy present before a process like wood burning, or in our case, the universe coming into existence, the amount of energy present before a process has to be the same as the amount of energy present after. And so if you start with no matter, no energy in the box before a process, then in order to equalize the equation, you're still going to have nothing in the box after a process. Sound pretty simple? Right? So if you start with nothing in the universe before the appearance of the cosmic egg, then no energy will be available to create itself in order to give birth to the ultimate cosmic egg. Nothing pops into existence is what the actual evidence says. Not a molecule, and not a tree, and not an empty pew is not going to ultimately just pop into existence, is it? And it's certainly not going to come to life and start walking around. It doesn't matter how much time you wait for that to happen. Nothing is going to pop into existence from nothing, especially not a small sphere containing all of the energy of the entire universe. That's not going to happen according to the evidence. According to the first law of thermodynamics, which remember does not have exceptions, there has never been an exception to the law witnessed, and so by implication it would be unscientific. It would go against the laws of science to believe that matter and energy could come into being in such a way that the first law of thermodynamics was violated. So according to this law, the only way that matter can appear inside of that box is if it was caused to appear there by something outside, an outside being. That's what you learn from science. Now, evolutionists who believe in spontaneous generation actually admit that there's no evidence for it. Atheist Victor Stenger is an evolutionary particle physicist and professor at the University of Colorado, and he's a believer in this idea of spontaneous generation, but he actually came out and said, I must admit that there are yet no empirical or observational tests that can be used to test the idea of an accidental origin. Now, wait a minute. The naturalist definition of science includes the ability to observe and test a theory. You have to be able to gather evidence in that way. Are you telling me the spontaneous generation of matter is a genuine blind faith? Okay, now true Christianity is built on faith, but it's not blind. We actually have an abundant amount of evidence to support what we believe in. The trust that we have in the Christian system is based on evidence. It's not a blind leap into the dark. But according to the atheists themselves, there is no evidence to support the spontaneous generation of matter. Now consider, if there's no scientific evidence for it, then how can this idea be considered scientific? There's no way to test it. It is a leap into the dark without evidence.
Here's what Richard Dawkins said in an interview in 2012. Of course it's counterintuitive that you can get something from nothing. Of course common sense doesn't allow you to get something from nothing. That's why it's interesting. It's got to be interesting in order to give rise to the universe at all. Something pretty mysterious had to give rise to the origin of the universe.
Now, I don't know about you, but I find that kind of important admission. It's counterintuitive. It goes against common sense in order to say that the universe could just come from nothing. But according to him, that's just interesting. It's not really a problem, it's just interesting. Something pretty mysterious had to give rise to the origin of the universe. Well, I'll give him that. It has to be supernatural. That's what we're talking about here. The origin of the universe is not explainable in a natural way. And so no wonder many evolutionists reject spontaneous generation as an option for the origin of the universe. Robert Jastrow, famous evolutionary astronomer, notice what he said. The creation of matter out of nothing would violate a cherished concept in science, the principle of the conservation of matter and energy, or the first law of thermodynamics, which states that matter and energy can be neither created nor destroyed. Matter can be converted into energy and vice versa, but the total amount of all matter and energy in the universe must remain unchanged forever. It's difficult to accept a theory that violates such a firmly established scientific fact. All right, pretty straightforward. Well, what about quantum mechanics? Doesn't quantum theory indicate that something can come from nothing? This is a relatively recent argument being made by some in the atheistic community. Now, just briefly, we got a lot of material that goes into this more in depth, but briefly, keep in mind that quantum fluctuations convert energy to matter, and therefore they have to first start with energy. You have to have a quantum field. Amanda Gefter, writing in New Scientist, said this: quantum mechanics tells us that the vacuum of space is not empty. Instead, it crackles with energy. So even if the quantum fluctuation idea were true, it's still not answering the ultimate question. Where did the energy of the universe come from? Now, Stephen Hawking attempts to argue that the universe could pop into existence since he believes there's a sum total zero energy balance in the universe now. Okay? And there was absolutely no energy before the cosmic egg appeared. And so he says, okay, so you had zero energy then, and you've got zero now. And so he says, see, the first law wouldn't be violated by energy creating itself at the beginning. Now, even if he could prove that there's a zero energy balance in the entire universe now, which he can't, he still admits that there was no energy in the universe before, and now there is energy, although he arbitrarily assigns positive and negative signs to it. Now, regardless of its signs, it is energy. And according to the first law of thermodynamics, that energy has to be accounted for. It can be neither created nor destroyed in any natural process. And so the naturalist still has no answer to the ultimate question. How can you start with no energy and end with energy without violating all of the evidence from science that we have, the first law of thermodynamics? So strictly according to the scientific evidence, the laws of science, specifically the first law of thermodynamics, the spontaneous generation of matter could not have happened. Now keep in mind again, scientific laws do not have exceptions, or by definition they would not be laws. Scientific laws describe regularities that apply to all scenarios that the law applies to. So in order for something to be a law, scientists could never have observed any exception to the rule. a prominent thermodynamics textbook that's used in engineering course curricula, says this: the basis of every law of nature is experimental evidence, and this is true also of the first law of thermodynamics. Many different experiments have been conducted on the first law, and notice, every one thus far has verified it, either directly or indirectly. The first law has never been disproved. We can say that the second law of thermodynamics, which we'll talk about in a moment, and he says, like every other law of nature, rests on experimental evidence. Every relevant experiment that has been conducted, either directly or indirectly, verifies the second law, and no experiment has ever been conducted that contradicts the second law. The basis of the second law is, therefore, experimental evidence. The evidence from science is that the laws of thermodynamics are immutable. They are unbreakable, so we call them laws. So when the first law indicates that you can't have matter and energy, especially the whole universe, just come into existence from nothing, then it means it, and you have to be irrational in order to accept it. Notice, though, the creation model doesn't contradict the first law of thermodynamics. We got passages like Genesis 2:1 and 2, Exodus 20:11, Hebrews 11:3, that summarize the implications of the first law of thermodynamics within Scripture. The first law says that in nature, nothing, matter, mass, energy, nothing's going to come into existence from nothing. It's not going to create itself. And if you believe in an idea like that, it's like believing in witchcraft. The only way that energy can come into being in a system that didn't originally have that energy is if it is deposited there from something outside of the system. And so in other words, the universe box, which has everything in the natural universe, would have to be opened up. Energy would have to be put in there by something super nature, something outside of the or above the natural universe, which is exactly, of course, what the creation model says occurred many thousands of years ago. So truth be told, scientists didn't even formally state the first law until the 1800s, and yet God had already laid out the thrust of this thousands of years ago in the Bible. And so the creation model is in perfect harmony with science, with the first law of thermodynamics, unlike the evolutionary model. Now, what about this other option? Could matter be eternal? Now, truth be told, fewer people even subscribe to this idea these days. The evidence is so overwhelming that there had to be a beginning, and that's where the Big Bang idea even came from. So this is not a very popular idea today, but let's talk about it. The eternality model claims that the universe has always been inside of this box, and no one put it here, it didn't pop into existence, it's always been. And so it's either been moving through space forever, expanding, or if you believe in the oscillating universe model, you believe that the universe operates in a cycle where you have a collapse, another Big Bang, and expansion. Collapse, another Big Bang, expansion, like an accordion, doing this, repeating forever. And so either way, this model says that matter and energy are eternal. They've always been here, it's always been around. Now again, we got a major problem with that idea in light of the actual scientific evidence that we have available to us, and the problem comes in the form of the second law of thermodynamics. Paul Davies, a well-known atheist, physicist, cosmologist, astrobiologist of Arizona State University, writing in New Scientist, here's what he said: the celebrated second law of thermodynamics says, roughly speaking, that in any change, the universe becomes a slightly more disorderly place. The energy goes up, the information content goes down. This natural tendency towards disintegration and chaos is evident all around us. And again, he's right, no qualms with that definition. Now, returning to our wood burning example, when wood burns, all of the energy that was present before it burned is still present according to the first law. But according to the second law of thermodynamics, much of it is transformed into less usable forms of energy, like heat, in the case of burning a piece of wood. And after that heat dissipates, you're essentially left with a pile of ash, which of course isn't nearly as usable. And so in a technical sense, the second law again builds on the first and says that although the same amount of energy is present after process as it was according to the first law, some of the energy has transformed into less usable forms. This is known as entropy, and this is an irreversible process. Now what this means, practically speaking, is that everything in the universe is wearing out. It's decaying. Okay, so the universe is running down. We're running out of usable energy. Nothing lasts forever. And you can see this idea everywhere, can't you? Wouldn't it be nice if your car did not get older and deteriorate and you have to go buy a new one? Wouldn't it be nice if your room could get cleaner on its own without somebody having to inject useful energy in there? It's going to tend to deteriorate. It's going to tend towards chaos. A house's paint job is not going to get nicer over time. It's going to cost you several $1,000s for somebody to come paint it. Ultimately, the house is going to wear out. It's eventually going to collapse. This is the second law of thermodynamics. It doesn't go the opposite way. And again, just like with the first law, the second law has never been broken. It doesn't have exceptions. And again, one prominent thermal science textbook, to date, no experiment has been conducted that contradicts the second law. And this should be taken as sufficient proof of its validity. All right, so what does that mean concerning the origins question? What are the implications here? It means that the universe could not have always existed and we still have usable energy. According to the second law of thermodynamics, if the universe is infinitely old, we shouldn't have any usable energy left. Everything should be completely worn out, and yet we have an abundant amount of usable energy in the universe, in harmony with the creation model, which would say that the universe is actually relatively young, fewer than 10,000 years. Now, as with the first law, the Bible lays out the thrust of the second law of thermodynamics in Psalm 102, verse 25 through 26, for example. And so the creation model does not contradict the evidence. It doesn't have a problem with the evidence from science. And so the scientific evidence does not lead to the conclusion that matter can be eternal, and therefore most scientists agree with that. And so recall again the famous astronomer Robert Jastrow of NASA, considered to be one of the greatest science writers of our age. Concurrently, there was a great deal of discussion about the fact that the second law of thermodynamics applied to the cosmos indicates the universe is running down like a clock. If it's running down, there must have been a time when it was fully wound up. Modern science denies an eternal existence of the universe, he said. Now, 3 lines of evidence, the motions of the galaxies, the laws of thermodynamics, the life story of the stars, pointed to one conclusion. All indicated that the universe had a beginning. Kitty Ferguson's an award-winning science writer and evolutionist. She agreed it's also common knowledge that the universe isn't eternal, but had a beginning. And so many in the evolutionary circles, of course, acknowledge that, and that's why the Big Bang is the ultimate popular idea now. Now, many times a skeptic might say, now wait a minute, couldn't there have been an exception to the laws of thermodynamics at some time in the past? Now again, according to the definition of a scientific law, there are no exceptions. The laws of thermodynamics do not have exceptions. They are the fixed, unvarying conclusions from the scientific evidence. And so if you want to just stick with the evidence and be rational, you can't develop a theory that goes against this and just hope that there's some exception. There's no evidence for that. So to claim that there are unknown exceptions would be to claim something that goes against the evidence. In other words, it would be irrational. All right. The laws of thermodynamics are firmly established. They're beyond doubt. Now, a perpetual motion machine is a design that engineers might try to do that attempts to either to find an exception really with the first or the second laws of thermodynamics. It tries to find an exception to the laws. And numerous attempts have been made over the years to try to design such a machine, all without success. You know, if you could do this, you'd be wealthy. But such machines are simply impossible. Now, even the government of the United States understands this, whether or not they fully grasp the implications. The laws of thermodynamics have been substantiated to the point that in 1918, the U.S. Patent Office declared they would no longer accept patent applications for alleged perpetual motion machines. They were sick of getting applications for these impossible devices. They recognized the attempts as pointless. But as Philip Yam, writing in Scientific American, said, claims for perpetual motion machines and other free energy devices still persist, of course, even though they inevitably turn out to violate at least one law of thermodynamics. There's simply no exceptions to these laws. Now, to develop a theory that requires the breaking of the laws of thermodynamics would be unscientific. To develop a theory that sets the universe up as a perpetual motion machine, being able to last forever in defiance of the second law, is unscientific. It doesn't matter how much jargon a person uses to try to confuse the issue here and throw dirt into the air. Believing in such a theory amounts to irrationally drawing conclusions that are not warranted by the available scientific evidence, all of which supports the idea that nothing, in fact, can last forever. Now, some argue, like Stephen Hawking, now wait a minute, the beginning of real time would have been a singularity at which the laws of physics would have broken down. Okay, so what is he talking about here? All right, now to understand this, you have to understand a little bit of math on this, but we can handle this. In calculus, there's a scary word, right? We talk about limits. Now, as a basic problem, you might see, for example, a bottle of water leaking, and we want to figure out what's going to happen to the water level H over time. And so there's an equation for that, and we call it a limit equation. And we'd explain it like this. As time ticks by and the height of the water in the bottle is changing, what's eventually going to happen to the height of the water? Okay, in this case, h is going to become 0 over time. So the limit of the water height over time, the final state of the water height, is 0, right? All right, now let's apply this to the Big Bang. Now the limit equations are different, and they would have inverse equations like this one on the screen, 1 over x. Now, if you were to go back through time according to the Big Bang model, and you were to subtract more and more of the radius of the universe, for example, and eventually cram everything back into the original cosmic egg, you're going to have a case where basically the x in this equation, like the radius maybe of the universe, becomes 0. And so you're trying to find the ultimate limit, the final state of a situation where you have a 1 divided by a 0. Now, if you know anything about math, you know that's not a good thing. That's not a good situation. You call it a singularity. And the equations just don't work right in that situation. And that's what that quote is getting at. If you follow the equations of the Big Bang out, you're going to get to a point where the equations don't work because of, for example, the singularity idea. And so the quibble is, hey, you can't use the first law to disprove the spontaneous generation of the universe because the laws didn't apply at the beginning. They break down in the case of a singularity. They don't work. Okay, now my first problem with that argument is that it admits that the laws of nature don't work in a fundamental way with the Big Bang model. In other words, the Big Bang requires that the singularity which began the Big Bang had to come about naturally, and yet if the laws of nature don't work there, then by definition, the event isn't natural. So what does that make it? Supernatural. And the naturalist has now given up on being a naturalist. And so notice that no matter how hard they try, you just can't escape these laws of science if you're going to be a naturalist. Notice Hawking's admission after stating that the laws of physics would have broken down at the beginning. He says the beginning of real time would have been a singularity, at which the laws of physics would have broken down. Nevertheless, the way the universe began would have been determined by the laws of physics. Okay, so you want to have your cake and eat it too here. They want to eliminate the first law from the discussion because it indicates that, hey, you can't have a universe pop into existence, and so they want to eliminate the laws of science, but then they want to turn around and use the laws of science to explain the universe, how this could happen, because after all, if you're a naturalist, you have to believe in the laws of nature. They want to use quantum law to bring about matter, but you can't do that if the laws of science did not exist. So bottom line, the science community is naturalistic in its thinking. Everything has to be explainable through some naturalistic means, which means that everything has to be explainable through the laws of nature. But by trying to argue that they didn't exist in the beginning in order to resolve this first law conundrum, they've contradicted their most fundamental axiom. If the naturalist cannot use science and its laws to bring about the universe, then he has in reality given up on naturalism and become a believer in supernaturalism. So in other words, if the laws of nature didn't apply in the beginning, by implication, only supernatural phenomena could have existed to bring about the universe. And so it's just a question of which supernatural entity is responsible for creation. All right, now as we start to wrap things up here, you might have recalled at the very beginning that I talked about the origin of the cosmic egg, and really that's really the second biggest foundational pillar here of naturalism. The first big problem is, why do the laws of science even exist? Where did they come from? Who wrote these? So if you don't have a lawmaker, how could they exist? Humanist Martin Gardner wrote a few years back, he said, imagine that physicists finally discover all the basic waves and their particles and all the basic laws and unite everything in one equation. We can then ask, why that equation? And why are there quantum laws? There is no escape from the super ultimate questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? And why is the something structured the way that it is? So even if you ignore the little problem of how the universe came into existence in the first place, you still have to have an answer as to how the laws that govern that matter and energy came into being as well. Now, why are there specific equations and specific numbers that describe how things work? Equations, by definition, are not random. They indicate structure and design and intent and planning. They indicate a mind. These are kinds of words that can't be used to describe random chance processes in chaos, which are the words that describe naturalistic evolutionary thinking. How could a law of nature exist without a law writer? Remember Paul Davies that I quoted a while back? You need to know where those laws come from. That's where the mystery lies, the laws. They just don't have an answer, because you can't have a law without a law writer. The existence of the laws of science are proof that you've got a law writer that is supernatural. He's outside of the box, that ultimately put the universe here and ultimately created its laws as well. All right, so let's summarize here the evidence that we've looked at so far in this session. What does the evidence indicate? Number one, you've only got three options for the origin of the universe. Either it created itself, it's existed forever, or someone created it. Number two, by definition, the laws of science do not have exceptions. Number three, the laws of science prohibit the only possible evolutionary model options. The only possible naturalistic options you have, those are prohibited by the evidence we have from science. And number four, the creation model is in perfect harmony with the laws of science, and in fact even predicts their effects. You can see these laws of thermodynamics even in our biblical text. All right, so conclusion, the creation model is the scientific choice. It is the rational choice because it is the conclusion from the evidence. And notice it's the only possible choice once you eliminate the other options. This is a no-brainer, and of course, ultimately, this implies something. There is a God. We've got a supernatural being outside of the box. Now, God himself wrote the natural laws into existence. God alone is capable of such a feat. Laws certainly can't write themselves. And notice that, you remember in the book of Job, God is humbling Job with the fact that Job knows essentially nothing about the universe relative to God. He's not in a position to go question God and say, hey, God, why is this happening to me? I deserve an explanation. God is basically like, look, you don't understand what you're even asking. And one of the questions that God asked Job to humble him, do you know the ordinances or the laws of the heavens, and can you set their dominion over the earth? And of course, the implied answer is no, sir. Right? I don't know. I mean, we didn't even discover half of these laws until millennia after Job even was given this question by God. But we know by implication that God is the one ultimately that did this. He's the one that wrote the laws of science and created them to govern the universe in which we live. If this information that we're going to be going over a lot this week, and a lot of this is included in our materials at AP. We've got materials set up here in the back, tables. Be sure to go back there and look at that. Make sure that you have the information you need to answer the questions that you have. Specifically, these two products are very relevant to the things we're discussing this weekend. There's also some other products that are put out by the other science guys that are here this weekend that we have available back there as well. If these kinds of things are of interest to you, then we encourage you to go to our website at apologeticspress.org and look at the offerings that we have there available for free. We have other products that are available for purchase that we print or that we produce and sell, DVDs and books and several other offerings there. If you have any specific questions that you might have for me or any of the people at Apologetics Press that might be relevant to, we encourage you to email us at mail@apologeticspress.org. Thank you very much for your attention.